And Martin O'Donoghue, leaving school at 14, his first job as a waiter in the famous Dublin restaurant Jamais, studying accountancy, then economics, becoming a mature student in Trinity, excelling there, becoming himself an economics professor, his role in the Investment in Education report, recruited by Jack Lynch as his economic advisor and standing in the 1977 election, becoming a minister on his first day in the Dáil. And when Charles Haughey becomes Fianna Fáil leader, Martin O'Donoghue suffering what he called the Stalinist treatment, being airbrushed, as was Lynch, he claimed, airbrushed out of history. And he discusses the differences as he saw them between the two men. Later this morning, this.
We're going to get the Stalinist treatment. We never existed. We'll be airbrushed out of the history books. And I reckoned he would do the same thing to Jack Lynch, and he did. We never happened. We weren't there. Or if we did, we were some sort of enemies of the people.
What happened at the beginning of the post-Lynch era later. But we begin with Martin O'Donoghue's early years and his early links to Fianna Fáil.
I'd grown up in a Fianna Fáil household. We were always traditionally Fianna Fáil voters.
His political loyalty, he always maintained, had been not to Fianna Fáil, but to Jack Lynch.
I think I'd put it that I gave a lot of my political life to the period when Jack Lynch was leader. And I would draw a sharp distinction between working for Jack Lynch and being involved in Fianna Fáil.
He had come into politics at Lynch's invitation.
I always remember him saying to me once, if we're really serious about trying to bring about a united Ireland, we have to show that we're capable of dealing with the divisions in our own community. And so he started applying that, whether it was trying to get over all this partisan nature in small ways, like the courts, in social issues like contraception, and also, of course, then in many other areas.
And summed him up in these terms.
Statesman rather than a politician, in other words.
Jack Lynch admired the tenacity with which Martin O'Donoghue had pursued his career, having started without any particular advantages, as he outlines in this 2002 interview with Olivia O'Leary.
Born between the canals, as Brendan Behan would say. Unfortunately, my father died when I was 9. At that stage, it was just a brother and myself at home, and my sister. I left school at 14 because what little money my father had been able to leave in insurance policies was gone, because this is the war years and things are very tough. So left school early, a succession of jobs. My very first job was in Jamais restaurant. Marvellous summer, wonderful education, 1947. All these hungry British tourists coming over and unable to believe they could have such sumptuous repast.
It was Dublin's finest restaurant, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
And you did what?
Oh, as they say, commie waiter. And by the time the summer was nearly over, I must have been fairly good at that too. I was promoted to be the commie waiter in what was known as the Blue Room. That's where they hosted all the private functions. So I can remember being with the waiters who served Sean Lemass and other government ministers at various functions at the time.
Well, you were supporting your family in those years. Mm-hmm. Then, in terms of your own education, when did you get that in hand?
I'd been Christian Brothers pupil. I hadn't very happy experiences with the first Christian Brothers I had, but towards the end, a marvellous superior who encouraged me, and when he tried to get me to go on to secondary school and some sort of a scholarship, and I ruled it out, and he said, well, don't abandon the idea. Make sure you go about it some other way. So I did. Eventually I got around to just studying in the evenings. I realised I would have loved to have been a lawyer, I thought, when I was at that stage with all the political debate and so on. But I realised accountancy was probably a better bet. So I actually began that way, and with no formal educational background, I began with what I think was called bookkeeper's exams. Eventually, by the mid-50s, I was working for Dunlop's, and I discovered that a number of the people there were going over to Trinity for an evening degree course. So I inquired about that, asked was it possible to get in. I didn't have my leaving cert or matriculation, but I was given the option. I could either do that first, or I could sign up, and then I would have to take a full arts examination at the end of 2 years in 5 subjects to make good my educational deficiencies. So I opted for that route, and then once I'd gone through that part of it, I in fact switched out of the BCom course, as it was then called, in other words, the route for accountancy, and switched on to the day course, the honours course. I had to negotiate revised working arrangements with my employers, Dunlops, to enable me to get to at least some of the lectures, not all of them. So I worked odd hours and studied odd hours.
O'Donoghue came to the attention of the political class in the 1960s with his contribution to the seminal report Investment in Education.
So that's how I found myself as part of a three-man team, and we were given 2 years to do the job. The idea of letting economists near education was a form of heresy, I think, in those days. So we had a marvellous steering committee of about 20 people representing every vested interest that you could think of. And a lot of those vested interests were not too happy with some of our proposals. We were very big into trying to promote the idea of equality of opportunity. And I suppose the classic example was, how did you provide decent opportunities for a scattered population out in the countryside? And our answer was the school bus. And that generated terrible friction. So much so that at one very stormy meeting with our steering committee, I can remember my colleague Bill Hyland slightly losing the cool and saying, well, if that's the difficulty, namely the moral dangers for boys and girls at tender ages on buses on dark winter evenings, he said we could have an Irish solution to the problem. We could partition the bus.
When in 1970 he was invited by the then Taoiseach Jack Lynch to join him as an economic advisor, he was an economics professor in Trinity College in Dublin.
I got my official leave of absence from Trinity on the 6th of May 1970. That happened to be the day that Jack Lynch had fired Charlie Haughey and Neil Blaney, and Kevin Bowman had resigned from the cabinet. He had written to me about a fortnight before that, a short handwritten note. He said that he was going to enter a very busy period in government, that he wouldn't be able to give economic issues the attention they deserved. My two first tasks were going to be look at our entry negotiations to join the EC, as it then was, and also to see what policies could be developed to cope with the domestic problems, because we were having a lot of strikes. He made the point that there was a certain degree of urgency. So that's how he asked when was the next board meeting, which I told him was the 6th of May. I realised then his note had been written on the 20th of April, which was the day he had been told about the attempt to import arms.
These were momentous years within Fianna Fáil. There was the arms crisis, the arms trial, Charles Haughey's acquittal, his years in the wilderness, Fianna Fáil losing power in 1973 to the Liam Cosgrave-led Fine Gael Labour coalition. In her interview with Martin O'Donoghue, Olivia O'Leary asked him about Jack Lynch's decision to bring Charlie Haughey in from the cold by appointing him again to the Fianna Fáil front bench when they were in opposition in 1975.
Jack Lynch was, I remember him saying it to me when we discussed it. He said, how can I in all seriousness say to the Unionists that we are willing to be reconciled for all of the things that had happened if I can't begin by trying to achieve reconciliation within my own household?
Did he really believe that he could reconcile Charles Haughey? Did he not know the nature of the hostility there?
Well, I have to emphasise again that if you want to argue for a peaceful approach, you always have to give the opponent the opportunity of ending, if you like, or terminating their, let's say, their more aggressive policies. So this was another effort, if Charlie Haughey was genuine about wanting to be part of a Fianna Fáil party that was going to pursue the De Valera Lamas Lynch policy towards Northern Ireland, then he could do so. So nothing personal, purely policy. So he wasn't going to be, if you like, left out in the cold indefinitely. Jack Lynch was not going to be vindictive towards him.
Martin O'Donoghue was among those in Fianna Fáil who appreciated that there was an opportunity for the party to exploit to its advantage what was known at the time as the Tullymander. This was a reference to the fact that the incumbent Minister for Local Government had the power at that time to determine constituency boundaries, and this had been crudely done by Labour's James Tully, who switched many 4-seaters to 3-seaters hoping that this would result in one Fianna Fáil, one Fine Gael and one Labour TD, with the probability that the runner-up and the loser would be a Fianna Fáiler. O'Donoghue's argument was that if Fianna Fáil could increase their votes sufficiently, they could win 2 out of 3 seats.
I said, because Tully has made a mistake with the gerrymandering. So I said, he's put a battleground out. There are 18 constituencies where seats can change hands. But I said, you'll need to have a very decisive set of policies. And by that stage, we were so opposed and angry about some of the coalition's economic policies that he said, well, now, if we're going to go down that route, I'll want you in the cabinet. I said, are you willing to be a candidate? He said, but before you say yes on that, I must tell you something in strictest confidence. He says, I am going to retire midway through the term. He says, if we win this election, I will not lead the party into the subsequent general election. And he's asked me specifically, what will you do? And I said, that's simple. I will resign and go back to Trinity College.
And O'Donoghue stood in a 4-seater in Dúnlaoghaire, to the surprise of many except those who had seen unpublished private opinion polls. There was a decisive swing to Lynch's Fianna Fáil.
The first count figures here in Dúnlaoghaire are not expected until late afternoon, maybe around 5 o'clock. Dúnlaoghaire, of course, is the Taoiseach's constituency, and there's no doubt that Mr Cosgrave will again head the poll and be elected on the first count. But the tallymen think his vote will be lower than in 1973. It looks as if the Fianna Fáil frontrunner David Andrews won't be far behind, and the Fianna Fáil tallymen here are confident of taking a second seat with Martin O'Donoghue.
And this pattern was nationwide. Fianna Fáil had won an extra 4.4% of the vote, but they enjoyed almost 9% gain in the seats. And in no fewer than 18 3-seaters, they won 2 out of 3. And this was particularly marked in Dublin, where there were 13 3-seaters and Fianna Fáil won 2 seats in 8 of them.
I prefer a fairly limited majority than a very large majority.
Jack Lynch astonished some with this comment, but he knew what he was talking about.
Because a large majority can make a government rather complacent and make government deputies too complacent. I prefer a fairly tight majority.
Lynch appreciated that his large majority had within it the seeds of difficulties. He had a majority of 20 over all other parties and independents combined. Not only did it mean that his backbenchers could indulge in a lack of discipline without much serious consequence, but Lynch suspected that among those new Fianna Fáil TDs who had won the extra seats, there were many who were Charles Haughey supporters. And when Lynch resigned and Charles Haughey was the surprise winner over George Colley, O'Donoghue's political prospects evaporated.
No love lost. I mean, he'd known since 1970 that I was one of his, if you like, opponents or enemies, if you wish. I noticed the day he was elected, I went back to my office after lunch. The Secretary of the Department asked, would there be changes? I said, yes. He said, what ministry do you think you will get? I said, none. He asked, what minister will we get? And I said, none. You better start clearing out your desk now, because we're going to get the Stalinist treatment. We never existed. We'll be airbrushed out of the history books. And I reckoned he would do the same thing to Jack Lynch, and he did. And I want to say I'm proud of the fact that I was given exactly the same treatment as Jack Lynch. We never happened, we weren't there, or if we did, we were some sort of enemies of the people.
The 1980s were complicated years for Fianna Fáil and for Charles Haughey's leadership. There were many what were termed heaves against Haughey. O'Donoghue was invariably involved. He was briefly appointed Education Minister by Haughey in the 1982 Gubu short-lived government, but having lost his seat and become a senator, he left the party when he failed to follow the Fianna Fáil line and oppose Barry Desmond's family planning bill. O'Donoghue joined the Progressive Democrats but never stood for them. He was one of that rare group of politicians who had been appointed as a minister on their first day in the Dáil. Noel Brown, Kevin Boland, Alan Dukes, Catherine Sapone are others. In retrospect, Martin O'Donoghue prospered under Lynch and was eclipsed under Haughey.
When people ask me what was the difference, why could I be so loyal to Jack Lynch and why could I never? The answer I always give is I trusted Jack Lynch completely, and I had no difficulty in doing so because he was a man of total integrity and a real gentleman. I never trusted Charlie Haughey. I never could.
Why didn't you trust him?
I think subsequent events have justified my action.
You're talking about the tribunals, for instance.
Yes.
After his political career, Martin O'Donoghue returned to Trinity as an academic and was also an international consultant.
I had no regrets about leaving Fianna Fáil. I didn't have any political base. I had come in as Jack Lynch's advisor. So yes, I was glad to escape.
The career of Martin O'Donoghue, economist, politician, former minister and former senator. Martin O'Donoghue, who died a week ago.